So in ventilating the lungs, okay, there's a unique challenge that's at play when we're talking about ventilating the lungs. Because the lungs are very, very soft tissue, very delicate tissue, and it has just millions of little alveolar sacs and millions of little capillaries, okay? So the ventilation of the lungs is done in a way that is very gentle so that it doesn't harm those alveolar sacs and those capillaries. And it involves a lot of indirect forces on the lungs. Okay? It involves a lot of indirect forces on the lungs. Because if we look at the lungs, the tissue of the lungs is the natural state of the tissue of the lungs is to be in a collapsed position. Okay? So sort of the natural state of the lungs is to collapse. But in a healthy individual, the lungs in the thoracic cavity are not in a collapsed position. They're actually in an inflated position. And the reason why the lungs remain inflated is actually because of the unique anatomical arrangement of the thoracic cavity. Okay? If we look for a second at the anatomical arrangement in the thoracic cavity, what we see is we've got obviously two lungs on either side. We've got airways that lead to those lungs. And then within the thoracic cavity, we have a set of serous membranes that cover each lung and line the inside of the thoracic cavity. So a serous membrane is a sheet of connective tissue that produces fluid. So serous membranes are sheets of connective tissue that constantly produce fluid, and they cover all of our visceral organs and also line the interior of all body cavities. In the thoracic cavity, those membranes are referred to as pleural membranes. So the visceral pleura cover the right and left lungs, while the parietal pleura lines the interior of the thoracic cavity. Those membranes produce a fluid that fills the space in between. The fluid is called pleural fluid, and the space is called the intrapleural space. There is, while we have air movement into and out of the lungs through the airways, we have no air in that intrapleural space. No air in that intrapleural space. We only have this water-based fluid. And water has this very special property to it called surface tension. Okay. Surface tension. So the surface tension of water is the idea that water molecules in solution are very attracted to each other. So water tends to stick to itself. Right? Water is very polar. And if you were to try to pull water molecules apart, they would resist that. Okay? That's the idea of the surface tension. So if you think of microscope slides, those glass slides that you visualize things on a microscope, when you put a little bit of water in between two glass slides, okay, how easy is it to pull those glass slides apart? Very hard, okay? It's very difficult to pull apart, but they slide against each other very easily, right? So the fact that you can't pull them apart, that's surface tension. So the same thing happens between these pleural membranes, okay? There's a lot of surface tension. So the lungs are stuck to the thoracic cavity wall, just like those two slides are stuck to each other. Okay. So because the lungs are stuck to the thoracic cavity wall, they don't collapse. They want to collapse, but they don't collapse because of that surface tension. Okay. If there's any break in those pleural membranes, right? So a puncture wound to the thoracic cavity. What happens on that side of the thoracic cavity? Lung collapse, right? Pneumothorax, lung collapses. Air gets into that space, it breaks up the surface tension, and the lung collapses. Okay? So what keeps those lungs inflated is that intrapleural space, intrapleural fluid, and the surface tension of that fluid. Okay? Now what that means, and sometimes I kind of call it the glue, the intrapleural fluid is kind of the glue that keeps the lungs inflated. What it also means is anytime the thoracic cavity expands or contracts, the lungs are also going to expand and contract, okay? Because of that intrapleural fluid. So when we talk about respiration, getting air to flow into the lungs and flow out of the lungs, that is actually going to happen very passively. Okay? Air is going to move down a pressure gradient when it moves into and out of the lungs. So inspiration or inhalation and exhalation are going to happen because during inhalation we're creating a pressure gradient that moves air into the lokes, and during exhalation we're creating a pressure gradient that moves air out. And like all gradients, pressure gradients, air moves in the direction from high to low. So so it's all in respect to, with reference to atmospheric air, right? And atmospheric pressure. So atmospheric pressure is about 376, is that what it is? Something like that. Millimeters of mercury. So for inhalation, we have to make the pressure within the lungs less than atmospheric. And for exhalation, we have to make the pressure within the lungs greater than atmospheric. Okay. So how do we do that? Okay. Did I say 300? 760, excuse me. So the atmospheric pressure is 760. So in this slide, what we have is a really simplified diagram of the respiratory system, or the pulmonary system rather. So the pink circle represents intraalveolar space, right? So all of the interalveolar spaces of the lungs. And the number here is referring to interalveolar pressure, the pressure within all the alveolar spaces. Up here represents the airways. The outer line represents the thoracic wall and the parietal pleura, right? And the inner line represents the visceral pleura covering the lungs. Okay. So outside the body, outside of the airways, we have atmospheric air at 760 millimeters of mercury. Inside of the lungs, in this particular picture, intraalveolar pressure is also 760 millimeters of mercury. So which direction is air flowing? Nowhere, right? Because they're equal, exactly. Okay. And then the blue space is intrapleural space, filled with intrapleural fluid. And that fluid also has a pressure. And if you notice, the pressure is actually 756, less than atmospheric pressure. Okay. Now, there is a relationship to keep in mind between pressure and volume. Okay. If we have the same amount of sort of mass of air, or the amount of air that occupies a space, if we keep that constant and we increase or decrease the volume of that space, we'll increase or decrease the pressure. Okay? So if we decrease volume, we increase pressure. If we increase volume, we decrease pressure. That makes sense? So same amount of air occupies a smaller volume, greater pressure, occupies a larger volume, lower pressure. Okay? So the reason why intrapleural pressure is less than atmospheric is because of this tendency that the lungs are trying to collapse. The natural state of the lungs is to collapse. But what prevents them is that surface tension in that intrapleural space. So there's this tugging inward, right, that sort of expands that intrapleural space, that intrapleural volume, and causes the pressure to decrease below atmospheric. That makes sense? Yeah, the natural state is for it to be collapsed. So it's only inflated because it's stuck to the walls, right? And because it's stuck to the walls, there's sort of this constant tugging, pulling it inward. There's a tugging pulling it outward, and then there's this equal tugging pulling in. That makes sense? So the lungs are want to return to their natural position, and they're therefore pulling on the fluid, and the fluid luckily is pulling back in equal force and keeping it inflated. Okay? Yeah. Yes, that's true. No, no. So this is a snapshot in time. Yeah, this is a snapshot in time, right? So this represents the pressure in between breaths, right? Or at the end of an inhalation or at the end of an exhalation, right? This represents no movement of air, this snapshot in time. Yes, ma'am. The pressure if you're holding your breath. It depends on if you like took in a big, if you sucked in a bunch of air, right? If you inflated the lungs and then held your breath, then the pressure inside is greater, right? Does that make sense? But what it represents is basically no airflow. Yeah. Okay. So if this is our starting point, we haven't done anything to try to breathe yet in this slide, right? No airflow, everything's at baseline. Now, when we want to inhale, okay, we want to have air movement into the lungs, correct? So we have to get this number in what direction? Lower, right? If we want air to move in, we've got to drop this value below 760. Make sense? Now, remembering what I told you about volume-pressure relationship, what do we have to do to the lung volume to get the pressure to drop? Increase it, right? And that's exactly what we do. And the way that we expand the lungs is by expanding the thoracic cavity, because it's going to get pulled along with it. Make sense? So inhalation is going to involve expansion of the thoracic cavity, which expands the lungs and drops the pressure. And the greater the increase in volume of the thoracic cavity, the greater the increase in volume in the lungs, and the more we drop the pressure and the more airflow we can get. Okay. And then when we exhale, we shrink the thoracic cavity volume, which will cause the lung volume to shrink, the pressure to go up, and then air will flow out. Okay? So let's see how that happens. Okay. I'm going to skip that for now. So technology is not my friend today. Okay. The goal with inhalation, like I said, was expand the thoracic cavity to expand the lungs. Okay. The way that we expand the thoracic cavity is by contracting muscles that increase thoracic cavity volume. So there are, for quiet, restful breathing, there are two muscle groups that are very important for inhalation. The most important is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is this big flat muscle that sort of sits over the abdominal viscera and represents the boundary between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Okay. The vast majority of restful breathing, the vast majority of the change in volume is going to be attributed to the contraction of the diaphragm. Okay. The other set of muscles that are important for inhalation are the external intercostal muscles. Okay. The muscles that sit between the ribs, they are oriented in this sort of crisscross way. And there's an internal intercostal muscle that moves one way, an external intercostal muscle set that's on top and goes the other way. The external intercostal muscles, when they contract, they lift the rib cage. And they sort of increase the circumference, transverse circumference of the rib cage. So external intercostal muscles and the diaphragm are critical for inhalation, particularly restful inhalation. The diaphragm, when it contracts, it actually becomes slightly more flat or less curved and increases the vertical dimension of the thoracic cavity. So if anybody has ever done any like yoga and yogic breathing or voice training or something like that, you know the difference between like chest breathing and like belly breathing, right? So belly breathing is particularly focused on contracting the diaphragm, and it's called belly breathing because when the diaphragm flattens out, it pushes against the viscera and your belly sticks out, right? And chest breathing is very highly focused on contracting the external intercostal muscles, and you get less sort of the tummy pushing out, but more expansion of the chest. Okay. But that's what it's connected to. So when someone breathes restfully, you have really mild stimulation of or contraction of the diaphragm, mild contraction of the external intercostal muscles. Okay. And if you were observing somebody breathing restfully, it would be very subtle movements, right? Very subtle movement of the chest, very subtle movement of the belly that would indicate the breathing. Okay. So what happens with this in-breath, like I said, the external intercostal muscles contract and the rib cage gets lifted. The diaphragm contracts and it sort of flattens out slightly. And both of those things increase the volume of the thoracic cavity. So this is before the contraction of the muscles. Okay. And then once the thoracic cavity expands, notice that the thoracic cavity expanded, the lungs got pulled along with it. You get this drop in pressure, not by a lot, right? But this is really restful breathing. And it creates this pressure gradient moving air into the lungs. Now, intrapleural pressure also changed. It went from 756 to 754. Why would intrapleural pressure change? What was? Exactly. So all of the pulling and pressures that I described earlier, it's exaggerated. So the thoracic cavity volume expands, pulls on the lungs, and that intrapleural space expands a little bit, and the pressure drops. Okay. Now, air moves into the lungs until the pressure inside the lungs is what? 760, right? Because then there's no more gradient. So restful breathing involves the contraction of the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles, while restful exhalation, you don't have to contract any muscles. You actually just have to relax the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Right? Because the thoracic cavity goes back to its original position, which is smaller, right, and creates enough pressure. Okay? So passive exhalation, those muscles relax and the pressure increases and creates that pressure gradient carrying air out. Okay? So that's restful breathing. Contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. Expansion, air moves in, those muscles relax, the thoracic cavity goes back to the original size, pressure goes up, air moves out. Okay. Now, when we breathe more effortfully, okay, if we breathe with more effort, we breathe deeper, we breathe harder, okay. It still involves the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, but those muscles get stimulated to a more intense degree, right? So we get more contraction of the diaphragm, more contraction of the external intercostal muscles, but we can also recruit accessory muscles. And we have accessory muscles that we recruit for forceful inhalation, and we have accessory muscles that are involved in forceful exhalation. Okay. The accessory muscles for forceful inhalation are located in and around the neck area, and there's a large muscle at the side of the neck called the sternocleidomastoid, and then below that there's the scalenus muscle. Now those muscles contribute to inhalation by lifting the clavicle bones, by lifting the sternum. And when somebody's using their accessory muscles for breathing, it's really obvious to see, right? So the skin gets sort of sucked in the middle of the neck and the sides of just above the clavicle. And when people are using accessory muscles to breathe in a restful position, you know there's really a problem, right? Because they're breathing, they're expending too much effort to breathe restfully if they're using their accessory muscles. Okay. So these accessory muscles help expand the thoracic cavity to an even greater degree, which allows you to get a bigger pressure difference and therefore more airflow. Now for forceful exhalation, we can also recruit accessory muscles. And there's two accessory muscles, sets of muscles that are important for forceful exhalation. The first are those other intercostal muscles, the internal intercostal muscles. And they actually pull down on the rib cage. And then try to shrink the rib cage. And then very importantly are the abdominal muscles. for forceful exhalation. Because when they contract, okay, the abdominal muscles push in, and they push on the visceral abdominal viscera, which displaces the diaphragm up. So diaphragm's not contracting, it's just getting pushed into the thoracic cavity. Okay. So internal intercostal muscles contract and pull down on the rib cage. Abdominal muscles contract and push the viscera into, and the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity. So that shrinks the thoracic cavity down, right? Gets pressure in the lungs even greater, so you can get more airflow out. Okay. And then if you think about it, that shrinkage of the thoracic cavity below resting volume actually sets you up for the next breath to be even bigger. Right? Because you're starting from a smaller thoracic cavity volume and expanding beyond that. Yeah. So forceful exhalation, by shrinking the thoracic cavity below normal volume, it sets you up for an even greater inhalation in the next breath.